Did you know that medieval romance was less about whispered sweet nothings and more about public scrutiny? Ever wonder how people fell in love when their parents were busy counting cows and castles? How about a first kiss that involved an audience? Or a marriage where one person wasn't even there? Prepare yourself for a journey back to a time when finding the one was a truly strange and often cringe-worthy experience, particularly in the years between the 5th and 15th centuries. Number 1. The public inspection of the prospective spouse. Imagine a scene unfolding in a grand hall, perhaps in a castle in Burgundy during the 13th century, or a manor house in England in the 14th. The air is thick with anticipation, and a young person, often no more than a teenager, stands before a gathering of strangers. This is not a formal dinner, nor a celebration of a triumph. This is the moment of inspection, a ritual where a potential bride or groom is paraded, observed and even physically scrutinized by the families of their intended spouse. This was not a fleeting glance across a crowded room. This was a deliberate, often prolonged assessment. For a prospective bride, the focus was heavily on her physical appearance, her demeanor, and her perceived fertility. Historical chronicles and societal expectations from the era often emphasize the importance of a healthy physique, unblemished skin, and a certain bearing that suggested good breeding and a strong constitution. A woman's hands might be examined for signs of calluses, indicating a life of labor rather than leisure, a trait often deemed undesirable for a noblewoman. Her teeth would be checked for decay, her eyes for clarity, and her posture for grace. These were not just superficial observations. They were seen as indicators of her ability to bear healthy children and manage a household, both paramount concerns for families seeking alliances. Consider a young woman, perhaps Lady Isolde from a minor noble family in Aquitaine, being presented to the family of Lord Gerard, a powerful landowner whose lands border her own. She would be dressed in her finest, meticulously prepared by her attendants. Her hair, if uncovered, would be neatly braided or styled, and her gown would be new or freshly laundered, signifying her family's status. She would then be brought into the presence of Lord Gerard's parents, his aunts, and perhaps even his older sisters. They would sit, eyes fixed upon her, as she curtsied or bowed. This was not a moment for conversation or polite introductions, at least not initially. It was a visual inventory. One might observe her as she walked across the hall, judging her gait. Another might ask her to turn to present different angles of her profile. Her hands might be requested, turned over and examined closely by a matriarch, who might even feel the texture of her skin or inspect her nails. The silence in the room would often be palpable, broken only by the rustle of fabric or the quiet murmur of the observers. For the young woman, this would have been an intensely unnerving experience. Every perceived flaw, every nervous twitch, every slight blush or tremor could be interpreted, whispered about, and ultimately factor into the decision. For a prospective groom, the inspection held different, though equally uncomfortable dimensions. While physical appearance was important for a man as well, indicating strength and vitality, the scrutiny extended to his bearing, his perceived intelligence, and his ability to command. A man might be asked to speak, his voice assessed for its strength and clarity. His hands might be examined for signs of military training, indicating his prowess in combat, a crucial trait for a medieval lord. His posture, his ability to sit a horse, and his general comportment were all under review. A young lord from Saxony in the 12th century arriving at the castle of his intended bride's family might find himself subject to a battery of subtle tests. He might be observed during a hunting expedition, his skill with a bow or sword noted. He might be engaged in a mock duel, his agility and strength subtly evaluated. The public nature of this inspection added layers of awkwardness. It was not a private family affair, but often involved distant relatives, household retainers, and even members of the local community. The reputation of both families hung in the balance. A rejection based on such a visible inspection could be a deeply humiliating blow, not just to the individual, but to their entire lineage. Historical documents from the time, such as land records and court correspondence, sometimes hint at the collapse of marriage negotiations due to unspecified physical shortcomings or unsuitable demeanor, though the specifics were rarely detailed. The very act of standing there being judged like a prize animal stripped the individual of any semblance of personal agency or romantic idealism. It was a cold, hard assessment of their worth as a commodity in a strategic alliance, leaving little room for emotional connection or mutual attraction to develop organically. Number 2. The Proxy marriage and the leg fling. Imagine you are a medieval princess, perhaps Eleanor of Provence in the 13th century, promised to a foreign king you have never met. Or perhaps you are a knight, Sir Reginald of Brittany, destined for a noblewoman across the sea. In an age of slow travel and political necessity, it was often impractical for both parties to be present for their own wedding ceremony. Enter the proxy marriage, a ritual designed to formalize a union when one spouse, or sometimes both, could not be physically present. While a proxy marriage might sound like a simple legal convenience, a particular element of some of these ceremonies could turn them into spectacles of profound awkwardness. The symbolic consummation, often involving the infamous leg fling. Proxy marriage would typically involve a stand and a representative chosen to act on behalf of the absent bride or groom. For a powerful monarch, this proxy might be a trusted ambassador, a loyal nobleman, or even a close relative. Proxy would arrive at the designated location, often a grand cathedral or a royal palace, representing the absent party. All the usual solemnities of a wedding would take place: the exchange of vows, the blessing by a clergyman, and the declaration of the union. However, the true awkwardness often unfolded when it came to the symbolic act of sealing the marriage, particularly regarding the consummation. In some historical accounts, especially those relating to royal or high noble marriages, the proxy was required to perform an act that symbolized the physical union of the couple. This was not a genuine consummation, but a ritualistic gesture intended to ensure the marriage was legally binding and beyond reproach in the eyes of both divine and temporal law. One of the most talked about, and certainly most bizarre, of these symbolic acts was the leg fling. The proxy, acting on behalf of the absent groom, would be led to a bedchamber. The bride in her wedding finery would be present. The proxy would then, in front of witnesses, often members of the bride's family, court officials, and sometimes even church dignitaries, approach the bed. He would often remove one of his leggings or boots, and then, with great formality, he would fling his bare leg over the bride's leg as she lay in the bed. This single strange gesture was meant to represent the absent groom's physical presence and the consummation of the marriage. Consider the atmosphere surrounding such an event. The bride, likely a young woman perhaps barely into her teenage years, would be lying on a bed, fully clothed, or perhaps in a nightgown, surrounded by onlookers. A man, who was not her husband, would then perform this deeply personal and strangely intimate gesture in a public setting. The very act itself, a man's bare leg touching hers in front of an audience, must have been profoundly uncomfortable. The witnesses would be scrutinizing every detail, ensuring the ritual was performed correctly and thoroughly, adding immense pressure to an already bizarre situation. Records from the 15th century concerning the proxy marriage of Anne of Brittany to Maximilian I of Austria mention the proxy, Wolfgang von Polheim, being required to place his bare leg into Anne's bed. While the extent of the ritual might have varied, the underlying principle of a symbolic public act of consummation was prevalent enough to be discussed in historical texts. The awkwardness extended beyond the physical act itself. The bride knew that this symbolic gesture was all that linked her, at that moment, to her future husband. She was marrying a concept, a political alliance, represented by a man who was not her intended. There was no personal connection, no romantic lead-up, just a formal declaration and the strange, almost voyeuristic public display for the proxy. The situation was equally peculiar. He was performing a highly intimate act on behalf of another, with the full knowledge that he was not the actual husband. His own reputation and integrity could be questioned if he deviated from the script, or if the performance was deemed insufficient. The leg fling was not the only form of symbolic consummation. In other instances, the proxy might simply lie briefly beside the bride on the bed, fully clothed, with witnesses present to confirm the act. However, the underlying theme remained a public, ritualistic performance of intimacy without any actual intimacy or personal connection. It was a cold, pragmatic ritual designed to satisfy legal and ecclesiastical requirements, but utterly devoid of warmth or romance. For those involved, it was a moment of intense public scrutiny over a private act, a truly awkward entry into a lifelong commitment forged through political necessity. Number 3. Imagine the end of a long, often boisterous, medieval wedding feast. The hall is still buzzing with the sounds of revelry. The remnants of a grand meal litter the tables, and the air is thick with the scent of roasted meats and stale ale. But as the evening progresses, a new, more pointed energy begins to gather. This is not the moment for discreet goodbyes. This is the lead up to the bedding ceremony, a deeply ingrained and intensely public ritual that served as the grand finale of a medieval wedding, often forcing the newly wedded couple into an acutely awkward display of their impending marital duties. The bedding ceremony, or charivari in some regions, was not a private affair. It was a communal event, an elaborate procession where the entire wedding party, including family, friends, and often even servants, would escort the bride and groom to their bridal chamber. This was not a quiet walk hand in hand. This was a noisy, celebratory, and often highly intrusive procession. The bride would be accompanied by her female attendants and relatives, who would help her remove her elaborate wedding gown and prepare her for bed. The groom, meanwhile, would be assisted by his male companions, who might offer ribald jokes, copious amounts of wine, and boisterous encouragement. The awkwardness began almost immediately. The removal of clothing, an act usually reserved for the utmost privacy, was often done in the presence of an eager audience. The bride, already perhaps overwhelmed by the day's events and the daunting prospect of her new life, would find herself undressed by her female kin, their hands perhaps lingering, adjusting, or even playfully pinching. The groom similarly would have his outer garments removed, perhaps amidst hooting and hollering from his male friends, their intentions surely well-meaning but incredibly invasive. Once both were in their night clothes, the public scrutiny intensified. Couple would be led to their bed, often a richly adorned four-poster, positioned prominently in the chamber. The witnesses would then gather around the bed, forming a semicircle or even crowding in closely. In some traditions, particularly those documented in medieval European chronicles, the couple would be required to lie down together in the bed, not under the covers, but often on top, in plain view. This was a critical step in ensuring the legality and legitimacy of the marriage, as witnesses to the physical union, or at least the clear intent of it, were deemed necessary. Historical accounts from the late medieval period, such as those detailing the marriage of Henry IV of England and Joan of Navarre in 1403, and even earlier, reveal that royal and noble couples were often subjected to this ritual. The purpose was clear: to prove that the couple was physically present and prepared to consummate the marriage. This was not about love or intimacy. It was about public validation and the guarantee of heirs. For the bride and groom, however, it must have been a crucible of discomfort. Imagine the pressure of knowing that dozens of eyes, belonging to your closest relatives, your new in-laws, and even strangers, were fixed upon you as you prepared for the most intimate act of your life. The air would be thick with unspoken expectations, nervous laughter, and perhaps even crude jests from the more boisterous guests. In some more extreme or folk versions of the bedding ceremony, the guests might even linger longer, offering advice, singing songs, or even playing practical jokes. The goal was to ensure the marriage was truly bedded and to ward off any evil spirits or ill fortune. The bed itself might be blessed, sprinkled with holy water, or adorned with protective charms. Candles would cast flickering shadows, illuminating the nervous expressions of the newlyweds and the eager faces of the onlookers. The departure of the guests, when it finally occurred, would often be heralded by a final round of ribald remarks and well wishes, leaving the couple to their new and now thoroughly public reality. The bedding ceremony, therefore, was a stark reminder that in medieval society marriage was not solely a private union but a public contract, and its consummation, or at least its commencement, was a matter of communal concern. Number 4. The dowry negotiation as a spectator sport. Imagine you are a medieval maiden, or a young knight perhaps, in the bustling merchant city of Bruges in the 14th century, or a quiet village in rural France during the 11th. You are told that a marriage has been arranged for you, a momentous decision that will shape your entire life. But before any talk of vows or feasting, before any hint of affection can even begin to sprout, there is a hurdle to overcome: the dowry negotiation. And in the medieval period, this was rarely a polite, private discussion between a few family heads. It was often a public, protracted, and sometimes highly contentious affair, turning the financial terms of a marriage into a spectator sport, brimming with potential for profound awkwardness. The dowry was a crucial component of almost every medieval marriage, particularly among the nobility and the wealthy merchant class. It was the property, money, or goods that a bride brought to her husband upon marriage. This was not just a gift. It was a substantial investment, often intended to provide for her future security, contribute to the husband's household, or even ensure the financial stability of the future children. The negotiation over this dowry was therefore a high-stakes game. These negotiations often took place in a central hall or a prominent room in a manor house, not behind closed doors. Family elders, often the patriarchs of both families, would sit opposite each other, sometimes flanked by legal advisors, scribes, and other influential family members. The prospective bride and groom, if present, would likely be relegated to the sidelines, forced to observe the haggling over their future value. The language used could be blunt, direct, and focused solely on material wealth. Chronicles from the period, such as those detailing marriage contracts between noble houses in the Holy Roman Empire, often record detailed inventories of land, livestock, precious metals, and even household goods explicitly listed as part of the dowry. Consider a scene where the father of a young woman, perhaps Lady Isolde, is trying to secure the best possible future for her. He might highlight her virtues, her lineage, and the strength of her family's connections. Quickly, the discussion would pivot to the hard numbers. Lord William, the prospective groom's father, might argue that the proposed dowry is insufficient, perhaps citing the extensive lands his son is inheriting, or the costs associated with maintaining his estate. He might point out the cost of feeding and housing a new wife and her retinue. The debate could become heated, with veiled insults exchanged about the financial standing or generosity of the opposing family. The awkwardness stemmed from several factors. First, the personal element of marriage was utterly stripped away. The value of the future spouse was being quantified in public, their worth reduced to a sum of money or acres of land. For the young people involved, hearing themselves discussed in such transactional terms, like a piece of property, must have been deeply unsettling. They were commodities in a grand financial bargain, their feelings and desires utterly irrelevant to the proceedings. Second, the potential for public humiliation was immense. If negotiations stalled or broke down over the dowry, it was a public declaration of financial disagreement and perhaps even perceived lack of worth. A family might be seen as stingy, or a bride as not worth the requested amount. Such a breakdown could lead to lasting social damage for both families. Prospective bride, in particular, might feel that her entire future was hanging by a thread, her personal value openly debated and potentially found wanting. Third, the discussions could delve into incredibly specific and sometimes crude details. The number of cows, the quality of a specific piece of land, the value of a chest of silver plate, or even the anticipated future income from a particular mill might be scrutinized. For the young couple sitting by, forced to listen to these intricate financial discussions about their personal union, it offered a stark reminder that love and affection were secondary to economic stability and strategic alliance. The marriage was a business merger, and they were the assets. This public display of financial wrangling, often protracted over days or even weeks, ensured that any burgeoning feelings between the prospective partners were firmly rooted in the pragmatic realities of medieval economics. Number 5. The formal request for lady's favor. Imagine a medieval tournament, perhaps at the court of King Arthur, or more realistically, a bustling jousting event in 14th century France. The stands are packed, the trumpets blare, and knights in shining armor thunder across the lists. Amidst the pageantry and the clash of steel, a peculiar ritual of courtship unfolded, known as the formal request for lady's favor. This was not a private whisper of affection, but a public, performative declaration of a knight's admiration, often leaving both the knight and the lady in a precarious and potentially awkward position. In the tradition of courtly love, a knight would often dedicate his martial prowess, his poetic verses, and his very being to a chosen lady, often a married noblewoman of high standing. This was an idealized, non-physical love, meant to inspire chivalry and noble deeds. The lady's favor was a tangible symbol of this devotion. A token, perhaps a silk scarf, a glove, a ribbon, or a jewel, that the lady would bestow upon her chosen knight. This favor would then be proudly displayed by the knight, perhaps attached to his helmet or shield, serving as a visible declaration of his devotion and her acceptance of his homage. The awkwardness began with the very act of the request. A knight, often adorned in his finest armor or courtly attire, would publicly approach the lady. This was not a subtle glance or a passing compliment. This was a formal address, often delivered with a bow and a declaration of his undying fealty and admiration, sometimes even in verse. The lady would be seated prominently, perhaps in a place of honor at the jousting arena or within a formal court gathering. All eyes, including those of her husband, her family, and the entire court, would be on her. Consider a young Sir Gareth, full of chivalric zeal, approaching Lady Eleanor, a beautiful and respected noblewoman. He would kneel before her, perhaps, offering a poetic plea for her favor, dedicating his next joust or quest to her name. The weight of the moment, the expectant silence from the crowd, and the intense scrutiny would create an undeniable tension. For Lady Eleanor, the decision was fraught with peril. A refusal, especially a public one, could deeply offend the knight and potentially lead to animosity or even a loss of face for both parties. It could be seen as an insult to his honor, something a medieval knight would take very seriously. However, an acceptance, while seemingly flattering, also carried its own set of complications. It was a public acknowledgement of a romantic attachment, even if purely platonic and courtly. This could invite gossip, speculation, and the watchful eye of her husband, who, while perhaps understanding the conventions of courtly love, might still feel a pang of jealousy or possessiveness. The subtle nuances of her acceptance, a warm smile, A brief nod or a direct offering of the favor would be intensely analyzed by the assembled company. Too enthusiastic an acceptance could be misinterpreted as a desire for more than just courtly homage, potentially damaging her reputation. Too cold an acceptance could be seen as a slight. The act of handing over the favor itself was also a delicate performance. The lady would carefully unfasten the chosen item, perhaps a richly embroidered sleeve from her gown or a veil from her hair. She would then present it to the knight, often with a gracious word or a significant look. The knight would then accept it with reverence, perhaps kissing the fabric or pressing it to his heart before ceremoniously attaching it to his person. This entire interaction, while elegant on the surface, was a high-wire act of social performance. It walked a fine line between expressing admiration and avoiding impropriety, between public display and personal discretion. For the lady, the awkwardness continued beyond the initial exchange. Her favor would be displayed by the knight in public, a constant reminder of their connection. Every victory he achieved while bearing her token would be linked to her, and every defeat might cast a shadow on her judgment. The formal request for lady's favor, therefore, was not a casual flirtation but a highly formalized public ritual that forced both the knight and the lady into a visible performative relationship, where every gesture and expression was subject to intense scrutiny and potential misinterpretation. Number 6. The handfasting or temporary union. Imagine a rustic clearing in a medieval forest, perhaps in the Scottish Highlands during the 12th century, or a village green in rural Ireland. The air carries the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, and a small community gathers not for a wedding as we know it, but for a handfasting. This ancient ritual, particularly prevalent in areas like Scotland, Ireland, and parts of Scandinavia, was a form of temporary probationary marriage. While it offered flexibility, it also came with a unique brand of public awkwardness, as it publicly declared a trial period for a relationship with no guarantee of a permanent commitment. Handfasting was a custom rooted in pre-Christian traditions, often recognized by local custom and community, if not always by the formal church until later periods. It involved a public declaration of intent to marry, often accompanied by the symbolic binding of the couple's hands, hence handfasting, with a strip of cloth or cord. This act was witnessed by the community and signified that the couple would live together as husband and wife for a trial period, typically a year and a day. At the end of this period, they would either choose to make their union permanent through a formal church wedding, or they could part ways without legal or social stigma. The awkwardness of handfasting was inherent in its provisional nature. The ceremony itself, while often joyful, carried an unspoken caveat. We are trying this out. Couple, perhaps young and full of hope, were publicly entering a union that might not last. The community, acting as witnesses, would be acutely aware of this. Imagine the pressure of living under the constant, albeit subtle scrutiny of your neighbors, knowing they were watching your every interaction, every disagreement, every perceived failure, all knowing that your relationship was effectively on probation. Consider a young couple, Ilara and Finn, in a 13th century Scottish clan. They stand before the village elder, their hands bound as vows are exchanged. Community cheers. But underlying the celebration is the understanding that their bond is not yet fixed. Over the next year, their daily lives, their ability to work together, to manage a household, and to demonstrate compatibility would be under constant observation. Neighbors might offer unsolicited advice, or worse, comment on perceived failings. If Ilara struggled with spinning wool, or if Finn was seen as too quick to temper, these observations would be discussed amongst the villagers, influencing public opinion about the viability of their union. The most acute awkwardness would arise at the end of the year and a day. This was the moment of decision, and it was often made in public. The couple would once again stand before the community or the elder. They would then declare their intent to either formalize the marriage or to separate. If they chose to separate, it was a public acknowledgement that their trial had failed. While handfasting was designed to allow for such a dissolution without shame, the reality of standing before your community and declaring that your relationship, which had been publicly initiated and observed, was not working, would still be deeply uncomfortable. There would be questions, whispered comments, and perhaps disappointed sighs from family members who had hoped for a lasting alliance. The implications for future prospects could also be awkward. While handfasting was less binding than a formal marriage, a woman who had been handfasted and then separated might still carry a certain social stigma, particularly if she had conceived a child during the trial period. Presence of a child would complicate the separation, forcing public discussions about its future and the responsibilities of the biological parents. For the individuals involved, handfasting allowed a degree of personal choice not always present in fully arranged marriages. However, it placed that choice and the entire process of relationship formation under intense public scrutiny, making the very act of falling in love and building a partnership a communal trial rather than a private journey. The handfasting, therefore, was a peculiar blend of freedom and pressure, where the most intimate aspects of a relationship were open for public review, leading to moments of profound uncertainty and social discomfort. Number 7. The public declaration of affection through song and poetry. Imagine a grand feasting hall in a 12th century Provençal castle, or a gathering of knights and ladies at a court in Champagne. The sounds of a harp or lute fill the air, and a troubadour or a knight himself stands before a captivated audience. This is not just an evening's entertainment, this is a medieval courtship ritual in full swing, the public declaration of affection through elaborate song and poetry. While seemingly romantic on the surface, this performance-based courtship could be a minefield of social awkwardness, exposing raw emotions and intentions to the intense scrutiny of an entire court. In the tradition of courtly love, popular across much of aristocratic Europe from the 11th to the 14th centuries, knights and poets would often dedicate their artistic creations to a chosen lady. This was not a private love note slipped under a door. These were elaborate, often lengthy compositions performed publicly before the lady, her husband, her family, and the entire court. The purpose was to declare devotion, praise the lady's beauty and virtues, and implicitly to establish a connection based on idealized admiration. The awkwardness began with the sheer vulnerability of the act. A knight perhaps more skilled with a sword than a lute would put himself on display, risking public ridicule for a clumsy verse or an off-key note. His reputation as a warrior might be high, but his standing as a lover or a poet could be shattered in an instant. The expectation was that the performance would be flawless, passionate, and deeply moving. Consider a young Sir Percival, perhaps more accustomed to the clang of armor than the strum of strings, standing before a hall filled with cynical peers and discerning ladies. His heart might pound with nervous anticipation as he begins to recite a long poem praising Lady Guinevere's eyes, her graceful walk, and her unparalleled virtue. Every pause, every stammer, every forgotten line would be noted. For the lady being serenaded, the situation was equally, if not more, uncomfortable. She would be seated in a prominent position, the focus of all eyes. The knight's words, no matter how flowery, would be directed squarely at her. Her reaction, therefore, was under intense scrutiny. Too warm a smile, too obvious a blush, or too direct a gaze back at the performer could be misinterpreted as encouraging deeper affections, potentially inciting jealousy from her husband or drawing gossip from the other courtiers. Yet a too cold or dismissive reaction could be seen as an insult to the knight's honor and his artistic effort, perhaps even leading to social estrangement or feuds. Historical accounts, though rarely detailing the specifics of failed performances, speak of the importance of these public declarations. Chansons de geste and the lyrical poetry of the troubadours from regions like Aquitania, modern-day southern France, serve not just as entertainment, but as tools of social maneuvering and courtship. content of the poems themselves could be deeply personal, sometimes revealing hidden longings or frustrations, all delivered in front of an audience. One famous troubadour, Bernard de Ventadorn, composed numerous songs for various noblewomen, his verses often exploring the exquisite pain and longing of unrequited love. When such a song was performed, the emotions, even if idealized, were made public. Furthermore, the public declaration meant that the knight's intentions, even if purely courtly, were laid bare. Everyone present would understand that this was a declaration of romantic interest, however chaste. The lady's reputation, already a fragile thing in medieval society, was constantly at risk. If she was perceived to be accepting too many such overtures, or if a particular knight's devotion became too intense, it could lead to accusations of impropriety or even scandal. Her husband, often a powerful and possessive lord, would also be a keen observer. While courtly love was an accepted social convention, the line between idealized devotion and actual infidelity could be a thin and dangerous one, and any public performance could be perceived as crossing it. Public declaration of affection through song and poetry, while forming the romantic bedrock of many medieval legends, was in reality a fraught, high-pressure performance. It forced individuals into a spotlight where their emotional vulnerabilities were exposed. Their social standing was tested, and every subtle gesture was interpreted, often leading to moments of profound personal and social awkwardness rather than idyllic romance.